Yeah, thank you, Shoal, for the great introduction. And hi, everyone, also from my side. In my talk, I want to talk about the biggest global issue that we are all facing today, which is climate change. And I want to take you all and see if we can, or how sustainable fuel can provide or can be used to address this global issue. Okay. So first, I want to cover some common ground. The global average temperature has been rising since the past 100 years, and the main contributor to that is the increase of carbon dioxide in the air. Since the Industrial Revolution, around the early 1900s, we've put so much CO2 in the air that it's risen above any levels that we have seen or we have been able to observe in the past hundreds of thousands of years. And this doesn't stay without consequence. I think we're all aware that the risk of climate change is very high. Increased droughts, floods, and frequent strong weather events, these are things we're already seeing today. So imagine what it will look like in 50 years. And most of people, or many of the people who are listening right now, and certainly our children, will live to see this day. So I think we can all agree on these three things: that the global temperature is rising, it's caused by our human activity, and that we need to do something now. And based on which polls you kind of look at, you can find support for these three things globally in many different countries. So that's where we're all on the same page mostly. But where we disagree on is how actually do we fight or do we do something about climate change. And the reason why we differ is because there's so many ways we put CO2 in the air. There's also many ways to prevent this from happening. But we kind of have to start somewhere. So I want to look at where does the CO2 globally come from if you divide it by very broad categories. So these are the CO2 emissions by sector. You see that energy production takes up most of it because a lot of the energy we produce comes from fossil fuels. Then the next two biggest chunks are transportation and industry. And I can't, in the next 12 minutes that remain, explain to you or show you a way how we can reduce the CO2 emissions from all of these sectors to zero. That would be a bit ambitious. But I can show you how it's possible to do it for this chunk here. So transportation puts CO2 in the air by burning fuel. So cars, planes, and ships, they all use gasoline. And I think it's obvious to everyone who's watching that this fuel is not sustainable. The fossil fuels in the ground that we turn into CO2 in our engines, this CO2 never goes back to fossil fuels. It's not a sustainable cycle. And now I want to look at the alternatives that we have for a more sustainable kind of fuel. So that but with the strict condition that the alternative has to have a zero or basically no additional, that the alternative puts no additional carbon dioxide in the air. That's the condition. So now, which would be the most obvious alternative if you think about it? Most people will probably think of electricity. It's a type of fuel. You can read up on that. And electric cars are great because they don't use any fossil fuels, so they don't produce any CO2. The only thing they need is electricity. But where does the electricity actually come from? 65% comes from fossil fuels. So although your car isn't putting out any CO2 directly, the energy that is required is still produced from largely fossil fuels. So this is really not an option for what I'm trying to do or we're trying to do today. So we'll have to look for something else. So what other options are there? My dad would now say, Listen, hydrogen cars are the future. So, all right. Hydrogen-powered cars don't need electricity to charge their battery. Instead, the cars contain a hydrogen tank where you can fill it up like normal fuel, and then the hydrogen goes through a chemical reaction, and energy is created. So no fuel and also no electricity directly, but the hydrogen is actually produced from natural gas in a process that requires large amounts of energy. And the energy comes from mostly fossil fuels. So again, this is not an alternative where we have zero CO2 that's in the end produced. Now, the third option is maybe not so well known, and it's the ability to create biofuel, which is basically like normal gasoline from plant biomass. So this can be fuel, oils or fats, or just rotting plant material, which is a nice idea because you have like a cycle. The biofuel gets burned, but plants can take up CO2. However, the issue is that this conversion process requires a lot of energy, and the energy largely comes. So I think, so do you see what I'm trying to do? I'm making a point here, and my point is that we think that our fuel is not sustainable, but actually the issue is that the way we produce our fuel is not sustainable, right? Because to produce fuel, you need energy, but the whole energy system on our planet is based on fossil fuels. So we can't really detach the fuel production from the energy production, and the energy production is not sustainable. And that is really the issue we have to overcome for alternative fuels, right? To detach fuel production from energy production, which doesn't really seem possible. So the only option really seems to be to completely change the way we produce energy and just use renewables or nuclear energy to really drop our carbon emissions to zero from fuel. But before we consider or we go to this way, I want to show you one more alternative, which is a totally different process from any other way to produce fuel. And it's schematic, but I'll guide you through. So the idea is to create a factory, and the factory is supposed to be able to take CO2 from the atmosphere, and in a process called carbon fixation, create biomass. The process carbon fixation needs energy, but by a state-of-the-art converter, we can turn sunlight into energy. And this is not a solar panel that I'm talking about. The biomass can then be in a second factory converted into something like biofuel. And this conversion process doesn't need any electricity. Biofuel can then be used in your regular car, will be burnt into CO2. However, this will be again taken up by the first factory. So in the end, you're not putting any more CO2 in the atmosphere. And this process would be able to create fuel completely detached from the energy production. That's not sustainable. And I think, people who know me or who are biologists, they kind of see what I'm doing here. So the first factory is just a plant, or more specifically, it's a plant cell. Every plant is able to take up CO2 from the air, and through specialized organelles, the green ones here, called chloroplasts, they can turn sunlight into energy. With the CO2 and the energy, the plant can build up all that it needs, sugar, leaves, roots, and all that, and that's what we call biomass. Now, the second factory is actually a bacteria, also a living organism. And some bacteria can, in a process called fermentation, turn organic mass, like plant material, into things that are very similar to biofuel. So this is really what we're looking for. We don't need any electricity from the outside, and we have a sustainable process to create fuel. Now, this was a bit of a weird way of introducing you to plants and bacteria because I was showing these factories. And that is the viewpoint of a synthetic biologist. And it's not something that's unfamiliar to you. Think back when you learned about biology, or when someone told you about what a cell is. You probably looked at a picture that looked like this. So this is how we teach about cells. You have to kind of imagine it like a little factory. So a cell can take up some nutrients, and in some kind of, let's call it assembly line, you know, the gray and the green line, the plant can take up nutrients and turn them into something that the plant or the cell needs to survive. For example, sugar or any other material. And the synthetic biologist now goes a step further and realizes that we can not only view the cell like this, but we can also understand it in this way, that it's a factory, meaning it's composed out of interchangeable parts. If we just understand it well enough, we can, for example, change the assembly line so that the cell can create something it's not normally able to. For example, biofuel. So I want to get now a concrete example of how one could actually take a cell that's not able to produce biofuel and turn it into a cell that can. And the specific example will be the production of biodiesel with microalgae. This is one of the more, let's say, realistic or better ways to produce a type of biofuel, because there's a huge variety. And for this process, you need two things. You first need some kind of oil and ethanol. This particular microalgae here has a very high oil content, or can produce very high amounts of it. And alcohol or ethanol, well, if you drink beer, you should know that beer is brewed with yeast, so yeast are very good at producing ethanol. Now we just have to take a bacteria, and this is supposed to be able to turn these two ingredients into our biodiesel. Now, as I said, producing ethanol from yeast is easy. The microalgae part is a bit more tricky, because there are some restrictions on the growth, etc., but it's doable. The really difficult part is this here, because no bacteria that exists today can actually produce biodiesel from just oil and ethanol. And why not? Because it's missing the assembly line to do that. So this is something we have to create now. And in the very first step, and I just want to show you the very first step in how you would actually genetically engineer this. So these will be our starting materials, ethanol and oils, which let's call them fatty acids. So we have to turn these into, in the first step, a biodiesel precursor. And this can be done by something called an acyl transferase. Now you don't need to know what this is. Just think of it as an assembly line that can turn these two products or these two compounds into our precursor. Now we can understand, or we can do this process chemically or biochemically in a test tube very simply, but we want a bacteria to do it for us, because that requires way less, or that's the way we produce it, because we don't want to do the work. The bacteria should do the work. So what we have to do now is this assembly line needs to kind of go into a bacteria. And for this we will use E. coli. It's the best studied bacteria that we know, and it's been genetically engineered and modified already. So if you want this E. coli to have this assembly line, you need to provide it with a blueprint of it. That means a chunk of DNA that the bacteria can understand, so that it can create the assembly line in its cell and produce, or will just go through this reaction. Now you have to do quite a lot of thinking on that, because many different of these acyl transferases exist in nature, and not every blueprint is readable by the E. coli, and so this really requires a lot of forethought. And in this way, you would think about each and every following step until you get to your biodiesel. And that's how you would engineer an E. coli to produce biofuel. Now, let's take a step back from this very detailed look at how to do this. I kind of want to mention a very important aspects of this particular fuel alternative, which is first that if we use biodiesel as in contrast to electricity or hydrogen-powered cars, we can keep the existing infrastructure because most cars could actually run on this biodiesel. And developing countries don't really have the money to invest in electric cars and all the necessary battery production and energy storage. And also, it's a very good for branding because you can brand it as a kind of green fuel, very new, very hip. So that's also something you have to consider. That's valuable. Now, the big question is, can we actually do this? Is the biology ready? And the answer is yes, because this exact process, what I walked you through, has already been done, actually by a couple of labs. But the issue is it's been done in a test tube in a lab with a few milliliters. But to actually make this work, you would need to scale it up to this level. And that's the main key or the main issue for every synthetic biology application. How do you take it from the lab to a scale where it's actually profitable? And that's has a lot of limitations still. So to finish, like, will this process be revolutionizing transportation in 5 to 10 years? Probably not. And that's fine, because that was not the point that I wanted to make today. It's not just about the biofuel. I wanted to remind you of this viewpoint of viewing cells like bacteria, like algae, as factories. And I want you to take a step further and think of them as changeable, so we can modify these cells to do whatever we want them to do. This can mean producing antibiotics, or anti-cancer drugs, biofuel, or even things like spider silk. And all that without the need for electricity that's coming from an unsustainable process and from fossil fuels. And that's really what I mean with the promise of synthetic biology. And that's it. Thank you very much.